My name is Dr. Sarah Myhill. I'm here speaking for Life the Basic Manual. I'm here to introduce a campaign that I'm setting up with my lovely patients, which we are calling the MAIMES campaign. It's an acronym for Medical Abuse in MEs. And we need this campaign because ME patients are not being well treated. In fact, my guess is they are being made worse by establishment treatments, and this amounts to a form of abuse because these people do not have the energy to defend themselves. I liken it to child abuse. There is another group of young people who have been sexually or physically abused and cannot defend themselves, and we now have child abuse public inquiries. MAIMES is all about demanding a public inquiry into the treatment of ME patients so they can receive proper medical, physical-based therapy. This situation has come to a head because of the recent PACE trial. And PACE is a microcosm of what is happening in the ME world. PACE was a study set up and published in 2011, and they were testing various treatments into ME, largely graded exercise therapy and cognitive behaviour therapy. Now, anybody who has any practical experience of treating ME patients knows that graded exercise therapy is an oxymoron. By definition, graded exercise makes ME and chronic fatigue syndrome worse. And in fact, if anybody sees improvement as a result of graded exercise therapy, then by definition, they cannot have ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. So it was a nonsense. And practical people like myself, practical doctors, patients, watched with interest because we thought it was inevitable that this trial was going to have a bad outcome. When the trial was published, the data suggested that 61% of ME patients were improved by graded exercise therapy and 22% were cured effectively. We knew this result could not possibly be right. And therefore, we demanded, I grandly say we, patients demanded that the raw data be made available for independent analysis by independent academic teams. It took 5 years for this to happen. Repeated Freedom of Information Act searches, court actions, and eventually this went up to the Ombudsman, who pointed out, yes, this is a publicly funded study. £5 million have been spent on this. Of course that information should be publicly available. This information then went out to independent academic bodies and who reanalysed it and found that there are many facets of the PACE study that were seriously and fundamentally flawed. The procedure, the way it was set up was flawed, the way the data was analysed was done in such a way as to square with the preconceived views of the authors. Spearheading this campaign has been Dr. Keith Geraghty, and he published his paper, which was a criticism of the PACE study and how it's run. The whole debate has been taken up by the Journal of Health Psychology, who then presented Geraghty's paper to the PACE authors and invited them to respond to that, which they did. Then all those 3 papers, the PACE study, Geraghty's criticism and PACE's response, were put out to independent academic institutions on both sides of the argument, and they were invited to submit a commentary. And all these papers and the commentaries were published in the August edition of the Journal of Health Psychology. Anybody with an interest in this debate, I thoroughly recommend you purchase and read this very carefully. The upshot of that was determined by the editor, David Marks, and his conclusion of the analyses were that he considered this to be a very unwise expenditure of £5 million of public money on a study that is fundamentally flawed. It's procedurally flawed, the analysis of the data is flawed, and the conclusions are flawed. In fact, this amounts to scientific fraud and indeed financial fraud. This study was compromised in many ways. Firstly, the authors of PACE and the people who financed the study all had a vested interest in ME and chronic fatigue syndrome being a psychological condition. Who paid for it? The Department of Work and Pensions. They want ME to be a psychological condition. The Department of Health, they too, cheap psychological treatment is cheap and easy compared to physical treatments. The insurance industries, the last thing the insurance industries want is for ME to be a physical condition because it will cost them a fortune, and they have already stated publicly that they want ME to be a psychological and a psychiatric condition. The authors themselves had previously published papers demonstrating the need for psychological therapy in ME patients. They too had a vested interest. When it came to analyse the data, the authors of PACE, and these authors are Professor Peter White, Professor Trudy Childers, Professor Michael Sharp and others, representing big London hospitals, St Bartholomew's hospitals, Oxford University, other areas of where establishment thinking prevails. These authors analysed the data, and when they realised they weren't going to get the results that they thought that they had stated in PACE, they changed the protocols. They changed they moved the goalposts, in other words. So much so that some of the patients at the point at which they entered the study had already passed the goalposts at the end of the study. Well, that is a complete nonsense. That invalidates the whole study immediately. Another problem was that the patients who were doing graded exercise therapy were told by the people doing the treatment that this was a highly effective treatment, that they could expect to see improvements. And of course, this impacted on the final end result because there was no objective measure of improvement. The patients were just asked, how do you feel? Can you do more? Are you better? That is no endpoint. We need objective measures. We want to know how many patients could come off benefits, how many patients were back at work, what was their activity levels after the programme compared to before. None of that was looked at. In fact, it's very possible that graded exercise therapy could have made some patients worse. Now, this may not appear in the study, but we certainly know of individuals who have undergone the PACE graded exercise therapy and were made worse, but that doesn't seem to appear in the results. So in essence, these authors obfuscated, covered up, manipulated and tried to hide this data by refusing Freedom of Information Act searches in order to come to a fraudulent result. This has been very damaging for patients. NICE guidelines are based on studies like PACE. NICE guidelines are saying ME patients should be given graded exercise therapy. That makes them better. It doesn't. We know from practical experience it makes them worse. Those people who suffer from ME have been denied benefits because they've been told it's a psychological condition, and if you don't do your graded exercise, i.e. if you don't comply with therapy, then we will withhold benefits, and they have been denied benefits. They've been denied pension benefits. This amounts to an abuse of ME patients. We now know without a shadow of doubt, and there is a huge amount of data now coming out clearly showing that ME and chronic fatigue syndrome are physical conditions driven by physical causes, and they need proper medical treatment by physicians who are trained in these issues in order to allow them to get better. They are having miserable lives, they are not improving, and they are risking other diseases and indeed premature death because they are not receiving proper medical therapy. So this is what MAIMES is all about. We are demanding a public inquiry, and the way we are going about that is we are asking individual people to go and lobby their MP and ask them to sign a letter requesting a public inquiry. My local MP, bless him, Chris Davis, has signed up to that, and we need others. We have about 100 MPs who've been adopted, about 20 MPs who have already agreed to sign up. The details of how to go about this are, if you Google MAIMES, it comes up on my website, and the requests to put your MPs are there. Once we have a sufficient body of MPs on side, we can demand a public inquiry, and let us hope that will underpin a future treatment of proper physical therapies for these very sick people.